Okay, good evening. Welcome to the Maison Française of NYU. I'm very glad to introduce you to an author who has written an amazing book about the US geography. Tonight, Brian Russell Roberts will present Borderwaters amid the archipelagic states of America. So you may wonder why I'm suddenly interested in geography, but it's because Brian's approach is also philosophical and political, and above all, it is at the heart of today's cultural thinking. For the archipelago is not only a terrestrial reality, it's also a paradigm from which we can completely change our relationship to the world and to our identities. Among the thinkers who have promoted the archipelago against the model of the continent, Edouard Glissant has thought of new forms of relation between countries and cultures. And Brian also discusses these ideas inspired by the Caribbean world, but also by the Indonesian archipelago. So just a few words of presentation of Brian Russell Roberts. You can find all the presentation on our website. He's professor of English at Brigham Young University, co-editor of Archipelagic American Studies at, well, this is published by Duke University Press. His publications include Indonesian Notebook, a source book on Richard Wright and the Bandung Conference, and another book, Artistic Ambassadors, Literary and International Representation of the New Negro Era. It's probably not anecdotal to say that Brian grew up in Hawaii, Indonesia, and Tennessee. So we will listen to Brian's talk during 30 or 40 minutes. Then I'll have a discussion, but you can already ask your question in the Q&A by clicking at the bottom of your screen. Brian, welcome to La Maison.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Courtney for organizing this event, and thanks to François for inviting me to speak this evening. And thanks also to everyone who's in attendance. Speaking at La Maison presents a unique opportunity for me. Some of the framing in my book, Borderwaters, hinges on reminding audiences that the United States actually claims a vast amount of oceanic space, its exclusive economic zone. It's an oceanic space that's larger than its land claims. And it's also larger, I say, and this is a quote from the book, than perhaps any other country in the world. And I say perhaps because this has actually been pretty unclear for the last decade or so. I found US government publications from 2012 and 2013 claiming that the United States has the largest, quote, the largest exclusive economic zone in the world. And as of about 5 years ago, the Wikipedia page actually affirmed this and said, yes, the United States has the largest exclusive economic zone. But then as of about 3 years ago, the Wikipedia page changed and then listed France as having the largest oceanic exclusive economic zone. And so that was when I introduced this word perhaps to the introduction, perhaps the largest. While I was working on page proofs and copy editing, the Wikipedia page changed again, and it listed the United States as having the largest exclusive economic zone. And it all starts resembling something like a stunt that Stephen Colbert might pull, engaging his audience and changing Wikipedia to suit whoever's needs. And today it is France, according to Wikipedia, that has the largest exclusive economic zone. But regardless, the United States and France vie for first and second largest oceanic territory. And ironically, given their vast EEZs, I haven't been able to find that the two countries border each other anywhere among all of their extensive water borders. I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from Brigham Young University, which sits on the traditional homelands and is among the traditional home waters of the Ute, Paiute, and Shoshone peoples. Further, before this valley was inhabited by any human group of whose name I'm aware, it was covered for tens of thousands of years by a vast ice age lake that rivaled the size of Lake Michigan. Today, that ancient lake is called Lake Bonneville. And for about the past 10,000 years, the Great Salt Lake has been Bonneville's largest remnant. The Great Salt Lake's outline is in white in the northern part of the map of Bonneville that you're seeing on the slide. And that lake takes up about 1/3, maybe 2/3 of Utah, or what's now Utah. The state of Utah is now one of the driest states, but here in Utah, I've been inspired to write Borderwaters by living between the high tide of ancient Lake Bonneville and the low tide of today's Great Salt Lake. In fact, the cover of my book is a lino cut similar to a woodblock print inspired by the Great Salt Lake's brine shrimp, red algae, and salt crystals. Borderwaters, as François also mentioned, was inspired by my experiences growing up in Hawaii and Indonesia, archipelagos that a settler colonial and imperial United States has claimed or bordered. And today I'll be offering an overview of my book with a few highlights on the project's intersections with the Martinican philosopher Edward Glissant's work on archipelagic thinking. So in 2013, two scholars at MIT published what they called a territorial map of the world that drew attention to the boundaries that currently exist between and among all of the planet's sovereign nations. As one would expect in representing the United States, the map marks the US-Mexico border to the south and the US-Canada border to the north. These two borders, of course, are the borders of the United States, as is intoned by a famous US patriotic hymn. Between these two borders, the United States extends, quote, from sea to shining sea. It extends as a vast continental nation of fruited plains and fields of grain, with a manifest destiny whose only east-west limits have been the blank spaces of the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. And yet, the territorial map of the world offers a substantial jolt in terms of the traditional continental US narrative, precisely because it does not represent shorelines as natural boundaries, but instead moves toward an understanding of the United States as a nation whose boundaries extend into the saltwater. As the map makers explain, this, quote, this political map of the world depicts the extent of territories, both on land and at sea, which are under control of all independent nations. The map incorporates exclusive economic zones, or EEZs, which are sea zones whose resources belong to their coastal nations. International law defines these zones as lying within a 200 nautical mile geometrical offsetting from a nation's coast. But as you can imagine, many coastal countries are not able to claim the full 200 nautical miles of ocean without having their claims bump into those of their neighboring nation states. Consequently, we see a proliferation of borders, a proliferation that takes us beyond the United States' canonized borders with Mexico and Canada. In the Caribbean, aside from bordering Mexico, the United States borders Cuba, the Bahamas, the Dominican Republic, the UK, the Netherlands, and Venezuela. It also has borders with Haiti and Jamaica, though the territorial map of the world does not register the contested US claim to Navassa Island that makes this so. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the United States unexpectedly borders Japan, the federated states of Micronesia, the Marshall Islands, Samoa, Tokelau, the Cook Islands, Niue, Tonga, New Zealand, and Kiribati. Still, another portion of the map reminds us that in the north, the United States borders not only Canada, but also Russia. While discussions in US media will often use the phrase the border as a reference to the US-Mexico border. And while other conversations may remind us of the lesser known US-Canada border, and while certain leaders in government have referred to the entire Caribbean as the United States' third border, few citizens will recognize the version of the United States with its unexpected abundance of borders with some 21 countries that becomes visible when we consider US maritime claims. And yet, it's not as if this version of the United States were a governmental secret. The US National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, makes all of this clear on its website. On a page titled Maritime Zones and Boundaries. On the topic of the 200-mile EEZ, the NOAA draws from the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Quote, with its EEZ, a coastal state has A, sovereign rights for the purposes of exploring, exploiting, conserving, and managing natural resources. B, jurisdiction as provided for in international law with regard to the establishment and use of marine scientific research and the protection and preservation of marine environment. And C, other rights and duties provided for under international law. The NOAA's discussion explains that the United States has subscribed to the maritime doctrine of the EEZ since 1983. And the administration provides readers with a map of the US EEZ that is titled, "The United States is an Ocean Nation." The map offers the following caption: the US EEZ is the largest in the world. Of course, that's disputed. Spanning over 13,000 miles of coastline and containing 3.4 million square miles of ocean, larger than the combined land area of all 50 states. So consider the contrast between the caption's uncharacteristic sense of US oceanic nationalism and the deeply conventional continental nationalism that continues into the present within the current US passport, the very document that regulates US citizens' ability to move beyond the United States' 2 land borders and 21 water borders. The passport's continental nationalism surfaces in many of the historical quotations that appear on the visa pages, whereas the NOAA directs readers to a map that trumpets the US oceanic EEZ as the largest in the world. The US passport advances Horace Greeley's famous 19th century endorsement of continental manifest destiny, quote, "Go west, young man, and grow up with the country." Whereas the NOAA points readers to an oceanic territory, quote, "larger than the combined land area of all 50 states, the passport has President Lyndon B. Johnson reminding US Americans of the specific landed forms of the United States' fundamentally continental geography. Quote, "For this is what America is all about. It is the uncrossed desert and the unclimbed ridge." And whereas the NOAA turns our image of the United States inside out by calling it an ocean nation, the passport showcases 2 quotations on the Transcontinental Railroad, including one that is inscribed on the Golden Spike at Promontory Summit in Utah. Quote, "May God continue the unity of our country as the railroad unites 2 great oceans. But lest we forget that what is geographically central is not the uniting of 2 oceans, but rather is the continental landmass, which extends from sea to shining sea." The passport advances Theodore Roosevelt's words, quote, "This is a new nation based on a mighty continent of boundless possibilities." Of course, even as Roosevelt imagined the United States as firmly based on the continent, he believed that the country had claim on a new form of seafaring manifest destiny that was not hemmed in by the continent's shoreline. During the final decade of the 19th century, with the Spanish-American War, a US-American imperial archipelago became the very object of what Roosevelt famously described as the United States' manly dedication to maintaining, quote, a strenuous life. We cannot avoid, he intoned, the responsibilities that confront us in Hawaii, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. Yet even as manifest destiny overflowed the continent and mixed with the oceans, indeed, even as Roosevelt called for the Panama Canal, which will enable us to have our say in deciding the destiny of the oceans to the east and west, he reaffirmed in 1917 the continent's primacy. If there was a destiny to be had in the saltwater, the United States nevertheless remained stalwartly based on a mighty continent. This is the love of the continent. This is the love of the continent, this treatment of the continent as king among geographical forms that is now enshrined among the visa pages of the US passport. So we don't need to look far to see the effects of the United States' long-running habit of seeking destiny in the ocean, even while using love of the continent to deny full national identity to the islands that it has claimed. Looking back to the late 19th and early 20th centuries, one may recall the US Supreme Court's insular cases, which determined that, quote, the US Constitution does not fully apply to territories acquired through conquest after the Spanish-American War, with the practical effect that even today, there is a refusal of application of constitutional protections to people recognized as US citizens. The insular cases are showcased in Chamorro poet and activist Craig Santos Perez's 2017 poem, Guam, Where America's Voting Rights End, in which Perez reminds that even when the United States has a president or had a president, like Barack Obama, invested in, quote, civil rights and hailing from the Pacific, the island of Guam, a US territory to which the insular cases apply, quote, remains a forgotten name. Perez's poem recalls that Obama visited Guam once, a lackluster visit in 2011, during which his plane landed at night on the Air Force base, refueled, and then departed. And that last portion of the sentence was a quotation from Perez's poetry. And in that, I see the kind of the pedestrian quality of the line and the rhythm echoing or resembling the pedestrian quality of Obama's visit in Perez's eyes. Of course, President Obama at the time of his 2011 stopover was grappling with difficulties that stemmed in part from the very Pacific connections that Perez mentions in his poem. It was no doubt anti-Black racism that undergirded birtherism's bad faith contention during and around the Obama presidency, that Obama was not born in the United States and hence was ineligible for the office to which he had been elected. Yet this racism existed hand in hand with the subtler and less recognized tradition of viewing only the continental United States as properly the United States, while viewing archipelagic spaces as irretrievably foreign. Consider the Twitter feed of birtherism's most visible and influential proponent, who peppered his birtherist conspiracy theories with references to Hawaii and Indonesia, the former being Obama's birthplace and the latter being one of his homes as a child. In light of this anti-island stance, it was unsurprising a few years later in April 2017, that when President Donald Trump's proposed Muslim ban was blocked by a federal judge in Hawaii, Trump Attorney General Jeff Sessions spoke in a way that further highlighted the administration's disregard for the islands of the sea. Here he is. I really am amazed, he reeled, as the head of the US Department of Justice, quote, that a judge sitting on an island in the Pacific can issue an order that stops the president of the United States. As a Caribbean-oriented follow-up to Sessions' remarkable dismissal of the US state of Hawaii for its geographical situation as an archipelago in the Pacific, we saw the Trump administration's reaction to Hurricane Maria as it devastated the US territory of Puerto Rico in September of the same year. Now, President Trump made landlocked and continentalist excuses for his administration's slow response to the hurricane. This is an island, he said, surrounded by water, big water, ocean water. At another point, it's very tough because it's an island. In Texas, we can ship the trucks right out there. But the difference is this is an island sitting in the middle of an ocean, and it's a big ocean. It's a very big ocean. For as good as the US institution of liberal democracy can often feel, minorities in the United States, whether racial, ethnic, religious, political, LGBTQ, or others, have long needed to contend with what Alexis de Tocqueville once called the tyranny of the majority. A tyranny which permits the majority, many times designingly, but oftentimes unthinkingly, to pass laws, make policy, and advance cultural norms that place minority populations at still greater disadvantage. Within the United States, the demographically based tyranny of the majority has operated in tandem with a geographically based analog, that is, the tyranny of the continent, which has valorized continental vastness and seen islands as inferior, and which has espoused the exceptional status of the US continental state, even while functioning to legitimize imperialism among islands and oceans beyond the continent's shores. I often take Thomas Paine's 1776 pronouncement in Common Sense as something of an origin story for the type of continental tyranny that has extended from the country's beginnings to the present day. Small islands, Paine argued, are proper for kingdoms to take under their care, but there is something very absurd in supposing a continent to be perpetually governed by an island. Here we see the blueprint for US American sovereignty from insular England was sketched in big structures across a vast continent, while the logic for a future US empire among the islands of the sea was already in place at the US founding. This logic set up the preconditions for President Obama's 2011 stopover in Guam and the Trump administration's dismissal of Hawaii and delayed response to the devastation in Puerto Rico. We see a tension between the country's mythic continental borders and its material oceanic borders. For as much as the tyranny of the continent has remained active in US American political rhetoric into the 2020s, and even as it has had profound material consequences for the emergence and continued existence of a US empire of small islands, the United States fetishization of its continental vastness lost its geographical anchor in 1983, when the country became an ocean nation, embracing the doctrine of the EEZ and thereby claiming more ocean area than is made up by the land area of all 50 states. In other words, while present-day US demographers may take pains to accurately forecast a date in the future when the United States will no longer be a majority white country, and while some prominent figures in the United States have played on white fears of this future event, scholarly and popular perception of US geography has largely fallen asleep with regard to an enormous shift that has long since taken place. Due to the EEZ's interactions with islands and archipelagos that are claimed as US territories, the United States lost its hallowed geographical status as a majority continent nation nearly four decades ago. It became a majority ocean nation. It became what might be called the Archipelagic States of America. The iconic stars that spangle a field of blue, these have represented the US states to generations of school children, but might seeing the United States accurately as an ocean nation admit a new symbolism, where the canonized US states and the territorial US states may be seen to flow into one another, to mingle and grate against each other, not in a field of blue, but in the blue waters amid the storms and the stresses of a nation that is mostly water. The flag's star-spangled blue ocean then becomes a site amenable to the existential seeking described in 1946 by the US-American writer Carlos Bulosan, who was a US national because he was born in the US territory of the Philippines, but who was nonetheless ineligible to become a US citizen due to racist US citizenship laws. Bulosan at one point envisioned stars floating in the blue ocean. In desperation and in hope at what he found while reading literature in the continental United States, he imagined, quote, boring through the earth's core, leveling all seas and oceans, swimming in the constellations. And then I would ask what constellations we might swim among in an ocean spangled with stars of canonical and non-canonical US states. What are the borders and waters that imperfectly divide and incompletely unify these states of grating coalitions and dissensions, histories and futures? What oceanic stories might literature and art afford to a majority ocean nation without endorsing US territorial claims and contesting them? Borderwaters looks toward literature and visual art to tell some of these stories. And in approaching these stories throughout the book, I consistently engage with archipelagic thought and thinking. I define this mode of thought as thinking that is thought by humans who are thinking about archipelagos, or by humans who are thinking with archipelagos, as we might think about an abacus, or by humans who are thinking about how archipelagos would think if archipelagos could think. At another point, I devote several pages to describing the ontology of an archipelago. And I suggest that this archipelagic ontology is bound up with archipelagic epistemology. Material, metaphorical, translational, terraqueous, archipelagizing, geoformal, temporally scalar. These are some of the attributes of an archipelago that I assume at the outset. And if a shorthand definition of archipelagic thinking might be thinking that takes the archipelago as a thought template or even intellectual collaborator, then this same list of attributes would also be salient within archipelagic thought. Of course, I don't imagine that I need to remind many members in the audience today that the Martinican philosopher Edward Glissant often used the term archipelagic thought. But within Borderwaters, I don't permit Glissant to exert copyright control over the notion of archipelagic thought. Archipelagic thought, I remind readers, did not emerge from Glissant or even from the Caribbean, but emerged from multiple archipelagos and archipelago-affiliated thinkers throughout the world. It emerged independently and with varying rationales in locales ranging from Indonesia to the Caribbean, to the Philippines, to the Cook Islands, to the North Atlantic, to Hawaii, to the Mediterranean, and to many other archipelagos. Along the way, I engage with archipelagic thinkers ranging from Antonio Benitez Rojo to Teresea Tewa, to Mokhtar Kusuma Atmaja, to Brandy Nalani McDougall, to Tiffany Yannick. Many of these originally disparate strains of archipelagic thinking have coalesced into a multi-genealogy formation that Michelle Stevens and Yolanda Martinez San Miguel have called contemporary archipelagic thinking, which is the title of their 2021 edited collection of the same name. And yet, for all of these locales and scholars, I certainly can't deny the power and import of Glissant's discussions of archipelagic thinking within my book. And so to close, I will discuss a few moments in Borderwaters in which Glissant's commentary becomes crucial and becomes melded with the thought of other archipelagic thinkers. To bring these thinkers together has often required translation and ascribing contingent equivalency to words and concepts in 4 languages and sometimes more. But the main languages would be French, English, Spanish, and Indonesian. In taking up this challenge, I've been inspired by Glissant's assertion in his 1996 Introduction to a Poetics of Diversity, quote, translation is among the elements most essential to this new mode of archipelagic thought. In chapter 3, I bring focus to the visual work of the greater Mexican artist Miguel Covarrubias, who in the mid-20th century created maps of Indonesia and the US Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands. In working with these maps as co-theorizers, I bring Glissant's work in French into dialogue with the Spanish language notion of the lado, or side, famously featured in Borderlands discussions regarding the este lado, otro lado divide created by the Rio Grande. Further, Glissant's French and the Borderlands lado come into dialogue with the Indonesian notion of wawasan Nusantara, an ideology embraced by the Indonesian nation state, which might be rendered in English as archipelagic perspective. This is from chapter 3. Covarrubias's representation of Pacific vessels sets greater Indonesia within this chapter's first iteration of the border waters. In this iteration, which largely looks toward indigenous cultures present in past connections, while sidelighting or bracketing colonialism, the Pacific intellectual Epelihaofa's continental men have not yet drawn imaginary lines across the sea, as he said. And the Indonesian state's later ideology of wawasan Nusantara, or the archipelagic perspective, exists as pre-state praxis, as individuals and communities take the sea not as a divider, but as something that links. This iteration of the border waters is not a mirror image of the borderline and borderland. That is, it doesn't involve a watery border and concomitant border waters. Rather, this iteration aligns with Glissant's commentary in his 2009 philosophy of relation, that, quote, borders between places that are constituted by archipelagos do not assume the form of walls, but rather of passages, of pathways. These borders are waters that are borders. And these borders among archipelagic islands invert traditional understandings of borders as they become not barriers, but passageways. They stretch from riverine waters and move not toward the land on either side or the conventional lado of the river, but rather out into the seas, out into greater Indonesia, and into the Pacific regional designations of Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia. Amid this vast set of islands and waters, the este lado, otro lado distinction collapses with the proliferation of archipelagic spaces, where islands' relationality is not land-to-land binary of lados, simply linked by water, but rather is a multifarious and multi-directional land-water relationality, a system of archipelagos, a coinage that I hazard because of the useful way in which pelago, or sea, melds with lado, or side, reframing the sea itself as a place to be from, as a lado, a place of existence, rather than simply a medium by which one may transit from one land-based lado to another. Within the archipelago, or Hispanicized archipelago, the binary word between is replaced by the multi-circuited and poly-relational among or amid. In this way, the coinage archipelago calls into question the default notion of a terraqueous network in which the project of crossing oceans is the project of crossing links between disconnected nodes of land, as is assumed in Caroline Levine's discussion of networks in her 2015 book, Forms. This mode of thinking through the border waters first asks, why not take the waters as the privileged nodes and the lands as the networking link? It then asks, could both waters and lands, without affording priority to either, exist simultaneously as nodes and links? At another point in Border Waters, in the conclusion, I devote space to several graphs that visualize computer-facilitated distant readings of various archipelago-affiliated words in the full runs of 3 major Americanist journals. These words include continent, mainland, ocean, sea, transnational, and archipelago. And as you'll see here, Archipelago is on the rise in the journals American Literature, American Quarterly, and Journal of American History. And yet, the question of distant reading is rather vexed in terms of archipelagic thinking in relation to some of Glissant's archipelagic thinking. I offer the following discussion in the conclusion. As I've contemplated Borderwaters' relation to big data and the way that algorithms might oppress, I have needed to consider the striking epistemological convergence between the machine reading of big data and what Edward Glissant calls continental thoughts, and continental thoughts to the degree that Glissant thinks in oppositions, which he obviously strives not to, but continental thoughts are often contrasted with archipelagic thoughts. So continental thought would kind of be the bugbear here. He says, continental thoughts are system thoughts, making us think that we see the world taken as a block, taken wholesale, all at once, as a sort of imposing synthesis, just as we can see through the window of an airplane, the configurations of landscapes or mountainous surfaces. And so just in looking at this graph, you can see how doing machine reading would roughly correspond to the notion of a continental thought. You see everything from a far distance. But concerns about a convergence between machine reading and continental thought are only amplified by the structuring metaphor of Ted Underwood's recent book, Distant Horizons, Digital Evidence and Literary Change, which came out in 2019, which describes the benefits of distant reading as we move into the 2020s. He says, you can drive across a continent and never notice the curvature of the Earth, but distant reading offers access to the planet's curvature, to the longer arcs of change that have been hidden from us by their sheer scale, taking us out of the car and placing us in the very airplane of continental thought against which Glissant cautions. Underwood explains, quote, the curve of the horizon only becomes visible at some distance above the Earth. So Glissant's caution against aerial views notwithstanding, questions of spatial and temporal scale are foundational to Borderwaters' archipelagic thinking. So my own stance, of course, is that admiration for Glissant should not keep archipelagic thinkers out of digital humanities airplanes. One need only recall the Cook Island writer Florence Johnny Frisbee of Borderwaters' first chapter, who, after a childhood spent traveling the Pacific with a ship's eye view, wrote the following of looking down at the Pacific Ocean during her first airplane ride as a young teenager. She said, through a tiny porthole, I could see 10,000 feet below me, a sheet of galvanized iron, corrugated, brand new and dazzling. The great Pacific rollers were ripples, end quote. Frisbee's mind immediately seized on the productive tension between distant and close, amazed to look down and see what she called a toy ship, and yet know simultaneously that this tiny craft was carrying a cargo of perhaps 100 tons. Similarly, Epileha'ofa sandwiches his foundational observation that the world of Oceania is huge and growing bigger every day between close and distant, between an on-the-spot car ride that helped him see that Hawaii's Big Island was, quote, growing, rising from the depths of the mighty sea, and a distant reading of the Pacific in which thousands of Pacific Islanders, he says, quote, are flying back and forth across national boundaries, the international dateline, and the equator, cultivating their ever-growing universe in their own ways. On this latter image of cutting back and forth, it's easy to imagine that Ha'ofa would have welcomed data visualization collaboration with the digital humanities scholars associated with the In the Same Boats platform, which presents users with interactive visualizations that trace the movements of significant cultural actors from the Caribbean and wider Americas, Africa, and Europe within the 20th century Afro-Atlantic world. And finally, as I display 4 different ways of graphing the appearance of the keyword transnational, I resolve the question of distant reading in relation to Glissant's archipelagic thought, reminding readers that Glissant's archipelagic thinking is interested in the chaos world's infinite particularity. As I say in the caption for this graph, quote, in the infinity of ways, a term's unending particularities may be visualized. Between the cosmic and the quantum, we see perhaps a meeting of the minds between Edward Glissant's archipelagic thought, which wants to see particularity right down to the very smallest rocks of the smallest rivers, and Ted Underwood's proviso on quantitative approaches, in which he says, quantitative approaches are no more objective than any other historical interpretation. They are just another way to grapple with the mystery of the human past, which doesn't become less complex or less perplexing as we back up and take a wider view. Rather than calling for an archipelagic turn in American studies then, I close by suggesting that American studies should become more attentive to an archipelagic gyre, analogous to the gyres we see in oceans throughout the world, to which myriad archipelagic thinkers, including Glissant, have been contributing for decades and even centuries. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Brian. This is amazing, and I adore your book. And this is such a huge contribution to archipelagic studies. That's great. So, also, of course, I enjoyed your references to Edouard Glissant. But I have many questions, and to the audience, please don't hesitate to ask through the Q&A your questions to Brian. So my first question is about archipelago. In your description, it's obvious and it's great to see that we can remap the United States by taking care of the ocean, of all the relationship with these foreign countries outside of the United States. I mean, outside, yes, connected to. But I don't know if you would accept to make a step further. What about the states themselves inside the US? Could we consider them, the states, as islands? And would it change something in our conception or in our representation of the United States to think of, that's a collection of islands? Of course, they belong to a continent, yeah. But just in our imagination, would you accept this, or is it going too far?
Thanks for that question. I think one of the constant tensions in thinking archipelagically, thinking with the archipelago as if it were an abacus, as if it were a metaphor, is that tension between the materiality of the archipelago and the metaphoricity of the archipelago. On one hand, I mean, there's this issue of it can't be that everything is just archipelagos, right? Okay. And that's the extreme metaphoricity. But then it can't be that nothing winds up being archipelagos. And we can be attentive to the materiality in ways that are useful. Your question reminds me of a question of the border that I was just discussing yesterday with some of my American Studies students. Of course, Gloria Ansaldúa talks about the border as a steep dividing line, and that's just in the beginning of Borderlands, La Frontera. And that steep dividing line actually very much resembles a quotation from Richard Wright in 12 Million Black Voices, in which Wright says that the word Negro is an island, and that island has steep cliffs that look out into a white sea of faces. And so thinkers like Richard Wright and Gloria Ansaldúa have been thinking in dialogue with the sea and shorelines in terms of what a border is. For Ansaldúa, it's most materially that border, that U.S.-Mexico border. But for Wright, it's a border that's policed by racial terror in the United States, and so I think there's some precedent for thinking of the islands as circumscribed by borders. But I would just kind of echo something that I said to my students yesterday. There are very few people who are trying to secure the Nevada border. Very few people who are trying to secure the Utah border against the Nevadans coming in. And in that way, the borders among the canonical United States actually wind up becoming kind of, I wouldn't call them prototypes, I guess I would call them types of the very border that Glissant talked about, where in a place constituted by archipelagos, borders assume the form of pathways and passageways. And in that way, I think we move away from that isolationist view of the island. I mean, Glissant famously said, every island is an opening. And that in that way, you've got the island not as, I mean, it completely undercuts, right, that myth of the desert island as the place where if you were cast away, what 10 books would you take? And because you would be in absolute isolation. And so there is something, I can go along with that metaphor. One of the things that Janet Hoskins and I talked about a few years ago at a conference in Singapore was, and this actually showed up in the book. She said, you're looking at border waters as you trace them out into the ocean, archipelagic space out into the ocean. But what would happen if you looked inland, taking the coast as the starting place also, but how far inland can you push those? And in the book, I try to trace those up a few different rivers, including the Mississippi.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Perhaps it's a question coming from a French guy, because archipelagic thought is so important for Europe, and also this, this system so centralized, very centralized, and just thinking not only of the territory but also of language, to admit, to understand that our language is a composition coming from different language, but well, we have to, because especially in France, we have the French language, and well, you are supposed to speak exactly the same French language all around the territory, but well, if you think of this language, you can hear, well, there are many Latin words and Arabic words and Britain, Normandy, from Normandy. But anyway, you can understand all this multiplicity. So that's also from a political perspective. That's why perhaps the federal system, the American federal system, is perhaps more a form of political archipelago compared to this European system. This is just what I had in mind by asking you if you would accept to think of the states as well, islands, even if it's a metaphor, of course. Yeah. So speaking of language, and you lived in Indonesia, and so what is very interesting in Indonesia about the language, that in fact there is quite a central island, Java, but that's not the Javanese language which dominates the other islands. And tell me if I'm wrong, if I'm correct, or I think that it's quite of a Malaysian language that is used, I think, for to avoid this central power of the Javanese language. So there are Javanese, Balinese, everybody could have one's language, but the common language is a foreign language, if I say. Well, so is it correct, or?
Yeah, you've got your narrative. I mean, I'm not in Indonesian studies, but my understanding is that you've got your narrative correct. It was the primarily Javanese independence leaders on Java were really cagey in saying we're not going to have Dutch as our leftover colonial language. We're going to have an indigenous language, which was, I mean, to a certain degree unique at the time. And then they were doubly cagey because rather than saying, and let's have the indigenous language be Javanese, they said, let's bring in the Malay language, which has functioned as a lingua franca across the archipelago in port cities. And so they brought in a language that had its origins kind of in the straits between, you know, northern Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula, but then it expands throughout the archipelago, to some degree already present and then to some degree superimposed. But it was developed, the narrative of it is that it was developed as an archipelagic language, a language that could link islands. And through that language, we have the linking of islands, which might be thought of as analogous to the distant reading. And then even as we've got the linking of islands through that linguistic move, we also have hundreds of indigenous languages that are continuing in Indonesia today. And I guess I would see that as analogous to Glissant's concern with archipelagic thought, shows you the rivers, shows you the rocks of the rivers, shows you the smallest of the rocks in the smallest rivers, and even the holes where the crayfish reside, where you get simultaneous granularity through multiplicity of linguistic traditions, and you get the distant reading, the far horizon.
Usually, of course, there is this opposition in Glissant's thought between archipelagos, island archipelagos, and continents. But also, it doesn't mean that all archipelagos have this archipelagic way of thinking of passage and multiplicity. And for example, would you say that the Japanese archipelago, because in Glissant's mind, there is this straight opposition between continents have this idea of roots, being from belonging to a country, and on the contrary, archipelagos are based on relation. And he opposed the identité-relation, identity based on relation, and from this archipelagic way, and identité-racine, based on roots, and it's more the continental way. But anyway, there could be archipelagos that have this very important conception of being rooted in the land.
I think you're right. If you'll I'll go back to this question of Indonesia, and kind of a tension that I'm always kind of trying to balance, which is there's something about the archipelago that seems liberatory to me, that seems ideal, something that seems utopic, and it certainly seems that way in Glissant's being. But I constantly find myself needing to walk that back and say that's some kind of an ideal of lateral rhizomes as opposed to the vertical root. But even to say that the Javanese leaders in Indonesia were cagey in saying, we're not going to have the colonial language, we're going to have the indigenous Malay language, that leans toward kind of the utopic, whereas people various islands in Indonesia and various people in Indonesia at different times have looked at Javanese imperialism, and when it's functioning in that way, then I guess I would associate it more with the root rather than the rhizome. And it winds up being something analogous to the archipelago winds up being something maybe analogous to the idea of communism. Has communism ever been instituted in a way that would be that would be admirable? That question is up for debate, and the same you could say about archipelagic thinking. Has it always been utopian? No, it definitely hasn't always been utopian. There's a scholar whose name I'm forgetting off the top of my head. I think last name is Herencia, and he says that the archipelagic doesn't solve anything. It doesn't absolve anyone, if I'm paraphrasing. But I think that's something that I myself need to continuously remind myself of.
There is a question appeared in the chat, not in the Q&A, so please use the Q&A. But I will read it from Sally. I like the idea of an archipelagic American language. Thank you for a thought-provoking presentation. I wonder how your book and work on the archipelago more generally intersects with the emerging discipline of island studies.
Yeah, good question. And thanks for giving a shout out to island studies. I came to the archipelago not through island studies. I came to it through Antonio Benitez Rojo. I came to it actually, ironically, I mean, I guess I feel like it's ironic that I first came to it through archipelagic studies as carried out in the British Isles. That's where I first saw the word, and instantly I just had this sense. I've lived in Hawaii, I've lived in Indonesia, I know what an archipelago is, and so what does it mean to start using this adjective archipelagic? So I came to archipelagic thought and thinking through Glissant and others, and then only later did I become involved with island studies. I see myself as participating in island studies in what Jonathan Pugh frequently calls the relational turn in island studies, which is synonymous with the archipelagic turn in island studies, whereas conventional island studies has looked at islands maybe as solitary units, and in isolation from one another, in opposition to the mainland. You've got the island. The relational turn in island studies, which I see myself as having converged with and joined up with at this point, is also an archipelagic turn in island studies, where there's a lot of overlap between, I mean, when I've read island studies writers working in the relational turn, they're quoting from Glissant, they're quoting from Antonio Benitez Rojo, drawing on their archipelagic thinking. And then I guess I would also see island studies, both in Island Studies Journal and the journal Shima, as providing me as something of a template for thinking about what it means when we talk about an archipelagic language. An archipelagic language I would think of as oftentimes a lingua franca that becomes useful contingently in order to link disparate groups. And what you have in Island Studies Journal, and then in Shima, based in Japan, if I'm recalling right from the masthead, you have journals that are using a contingent lingua franca, which I would see as a contingent archipelagic language that can fade into existence for certain uses of, certain utilities, and then fade out as different islandic traditions, which of course, there are all kinds dispersed throughout the entire world. contemplate themselves, but then they rise back up and then contemplate archipelagically? Thanks for that question.
Yeah, but I would say that's, well, the archipelagic thought implies not well, a neutral language, but on the opposite. And that's what you have pointed out in your book, the necessity of translation constantly. And that's because, well, that's a way of exchanging. I mean, you are obliged to understand the way you can be understood, and so that means that the relationship, yes, suppose changing by understanding and sometimes adopting the language of the other, changing, but not, you do this famous motto by Glissant, changer en échangeant sans se dénaturer, changing by exchanging, but without being denatured. So that's, yes, that's very important in your book also, the necessity of, yes, the translation. Yeah. So there is another question from Tufik, looking at the idea of linking and distancing within archipelagic thinking. How do you view such metaphorical archipelagic thinking for betterment of human civilization in which borders are continuously made politically? Indonesia keeps trying to use water as the idea to unite the diverse ethnics and cultures.
I think that's a really good question, Pak Taufik. And by the way, so glad that you could join us today. I'm really thrilled that you can be here. I learned so much from my time at Universitas Boas Maret and talking with you and other friends about my project and thinking through how archipelagic thought might relate to the United States. And so archipelagic thought for the question of betterment of humankind. One of the things that I find most appealing about archipelagic thought is that it really does deal in, it deals in simultaneous connection and dissevering, which I think permits ideally, the coalitional politics that become necessary to work toward social justice. And at the same time, the individual thought that, that permits individuals, countries, states to embrace their unique contributions to humankind. And I think that in that, I wouldn't call it a dialectic because that's like between and the between those two. But I feel like archipelagic thought reminds us that every between has multifarious amongs and amids. And so between or among or amid those two poles, you've got something that I would see as having something potentially good and salutary for the human condition. I hope that doesn't sound too naive.
So another question from Mara Di Gennaro. Thank you, Brian, for this innovative and wide-ranging new work. Does your theory of border waters and the challenges it poses to continental tyranny, a great term, alter any entrenched readings of particular literary texts?
Yeah, it does. I can talk about a couple different readings. The first reading that I wound up doing that wound up showing up in this book was of Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God. And I was telling some colleagues back when I first started, I said, I'm going to do an archipelagic reading of Their Eyes Were Watching God. And my colleague said, tell my horse is the right one to do that with. That's in the Caribbean. You need something in the Caribbean. I said, no, there's something about their eyes were watching God. And their eyes were watching God is great for an archipelagic rereading as as Lake Okeechobee overflows its levee and then floods continent space and creates an archipelago. And it's an archipelago that Tea Cake and Janie are traversing during that last portion of the novel, as all of those significant things are happening, as Tea Cake is contracting rabies, as they're making their way to the city of Palm Beach, which has both a continental and an insular face. And I mean, one of the things that I learned through doing that original reading was just the way that that floods create and take away archipelagos. It brought me to Deleuze's point that I love so much, where he talks about an island as a mountain that's underwater and a mountain as an island that's still dry. Another reading that I found especially illuminating has to do with Mark Twain's Huck Finn. And in that novel, there's at a certain point, Huck and Jim become separated in thick fog. Huck is on a canoe and Jim is still on the raft. They become separated. They're whooping to each other, as the novel says, whoop, whoop, in order to locate each other. At a certain point, Huck is following the whoops that Jim is making in the fog, trying to find Jim, and then Huck bumps into the land, as if Jim has been not floating down the river, but running down the side of the continent. And Huck is very confused until he has what I say is something like an archipelagic thought along the lines of Glissant, where Huck has this thought and he realizes, wait a minute, I have the expectation that the side would be the continent, but actually it is an island, and Jim is still on the river. He's just on the other side of the island. And I found that reading very useful at the beginning of the book, just because it offered something like a parable of what's happened over and over again in the study of US culture and US literature, namely, like Huck, scholars, thinkers, US citizens, US watchers have been bumping into the land, thinking because of their continental presumptions that they've been bumping into a continent, and that's what the United States fundamentally is. But in bumping into the United States land, they've been bumping over and over again into islands. And it's not continental thought that will help us decode what's going on. It is archipelagic thought that will.
Thank you. So perhaps, well, the last question, because it's perhaps time to end this lecture. So from Liang, thank you so much, Professor Brian Roberts, for your insightful talk and the conversations. It reminds me that the Outer Continental Shelf, OCS, of the US is delineated to be larger than its land acreage, and there are specific federal agencies working to, in their words, manage resources in the OCS. It is also perceived that the US has high geopolitical and geoeconomic stakes in the Arctic region north of Alaska. I wonder what, Professor Roberts, you think about ships and seafarers with archaeologic thinking. Archaeologic or archipelagic? No. I'm also remembering that ports like New York have historically served as sites of embarkation for both military and civic vessels that are arguably vectors of US sovereignty and state. It's a great question, and it cuts really to the heart of one of the dynamics that I investigated in Borderwaters, which is we're familiar with the conventional borderlands distinction. I mean, that complex of ideas there.
And in Gloria Anzaldua's liberatory work, the border is at odds with, well, I mean, the border is at odds with all that is good. I mean, she starts off Borderwaters standing on the beach at the border between San Diego and Tijuana, and the border fence goes out into the ocean. And she she talks about how the waves are trying to pull it down, and the waves become analogous to cultural pressures, mestiza pressures that want that wall down. And so the logic of the border, when it's in terms of border lands, is a negative logic. But with border waters, the waters are a little bit muddy. We've got bordered waters all over the world, as those maps demonstrated. And there are places where different countries come into contact and they have their land borders. And there are certainly drawbacks to having those borders and those assertions of sovereignty. One example that I could give would be a friend of mine, Fidelis Bueller, who's a US Kiribati of Kiribati descent, an American of Kiribati descent. And he told a story about how several of his relatives nearly starved to death out on the open seas because no one would pick them up, because all of the ships that were passing were trespassing in US EEZ. And so right there, you've got something analogous to the land border, something that culture wants down. But at the same time, you've got something like the EEZ of the Marshall Islands. And the Marshall Islands wants to protect its waters. It wants to protect its waters against things like the United States did before, blowing up dozens of nuclear weapons in its waters. And with borders, the Marshall Islands is able to do that. Indonesia is a similar case where they helped innovate the notion of the archipelagic nation state, which makes it so that this water territory is now sovereign. And the free space, the mare liberum in the world, the larger that is, the more privilege the biggest navy has, because they can go anywhere they want. Sorry. But as it becomes restricted, then the largest navies in the world can't go to certain other countries' areas. And so the water is muddy with border waters. I mean, Glissant talks about the unfenced totality of the world archipelago. Gloria Anzaldúa talks about the border fence that's getting torn down by the ocean. But it seems to me like in some cases, water borders actually could prove to be most helpful in some of the most urgent cases of today, which have to do with global warming, which have to do with oceanic contamination, which have to do with that start intersecting with the environmental humanities. One aspect of the EEZ is that a nation state has responsibility to look out for the environment of those areas. And if the EEZs could be used more along those lines and less along the lines of, oh, look, here's where we'll drill for oil, then it does seem like there's potential for water borders.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Brian. Well, there is just perhaps, that's not really a question, but that's just a remark about the Indonesian politics. Well, I will just read it. Thank you, Professor Brian, for the presentation. Considering what is now becoming one of popular geopolitical jargon in Indonesia, such as NKRI and Islam Nusantara, which I think linking more to imaginaries of the Malaysian archipelagos in the past rather than the Indonesian state. Yeah. Well, I think that's it. Perhaps time to end this conversation. Once again, Brian, thank you so much. Thank you so much, and congratulations for this amazing book. And I'm sure that we will refer to it. And yes, it's important that we should be involved in the archipelagic studies. And you are such a great example, a model for doing this kind of research. Well, thank you once again, Brian.
Thank you so much. It's been a delight to be here. Wonderful. Thank you.